You If you didn't get one on your way in, there's a handout in the foyer, so feel free to get up if you missed it on your way in, and it's not going to bother me. Let's begin with a word of prayer this morning. Our Father God in heaven, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for the opportunity to be together once again for Bible class this morning, to be able to be live as it is, and to be able to study your word again from the book of Exodus, and to glean principles and learn truths from your word that will be beneficial to us, that will be helpful to us, that would be faith building and faith strengthening. God, may we learn from Moses, may we learn from the Israelites, may we learn from your word about you. And as we study these things, may we be looking for your hand and your power and providence as it works in history. Thank you so much for your son Jesus, as he was the culmination of all of these plans and all of these wonderful workings, so that you might bring him into this world, so that we might have the opportunity of salvation through his blood. We ask all these things in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so as we mentioned, we have been studying from the book of Exodus, but we've been on pause, sort of, for the past couple of weeks. So if you're visiting with us, we're going to have just a brief moment of review just to kind of recall where we are, and maybe that'll catch you up to speed on what we're going to be talking about this morning. If you recall, from chapters 1 and 2, we discussed in the book of Exodus that we find that the children of Israel are in need of deliverance. They are in need of deliverance. That is, they are under oppression. Pharaoh and his army, Pharaoh and his minions are trying to do things to slow down the spread or slow down the growth of the Israelites. And so we see that there's a need for deliverance. Not only were they trying to kill the baby boys, but they were also making them serve with rigor and hard labor. And so we find chapter number 1 is largely about the need for deliverance, the fact that these individuals were oppressed and that they were being pushed down by the Egyptians. But then in chapter number 2, the beginning, the first half, which we studied the second week, or the third week, I guess, we talked about the fact that the deliverer is born. So the deliverer is needed in chapter number 1. The first half of chapter 2, we find the deliverer is born. And we know him as Moses. We know him as the one that was placed in the basket by his parents, by his mother, and was pushed down the river. And lo and behold, as we might say, it seems like it was just by chance, but we know by studying the entirety of God's word that certainly God was working providentially in this case to provide for Moses a place of safety. As he was the deliverer to be in the future, God was looking out for him and found him to be in the place of Pharaoh's household, namely his daughter, Pharaoh's daughter, and eventually he grows up in that household. Even his mother, his own birth mother, tends to him for a while. And so we find the deliverer is born, but then we come to chapter 2, verse number 11, and that's our main text for this morning, beginning there. We find that the deliverer is beginning to be prepared. The deliverer is prepared. But before we jump into chapter number 11, or chapter 2, verse number 11, I actually want us to notice that there is a bit of a gap in time. A gap in time between chapter 2, verse 10 and chapter 2, verse 11. We find that in chapter 2, verse 10, Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses and makes him her son. And she calls his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. But then in verse number 11, he was a baby in verse number 10, verse number 11, now he is an adult. When those days when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. All right, so there's a gap in time between verses 10 and 11. So I want us, though, to notice that we could say that the preparation of Moses is actually even taking place in that gap of time. Turn with me to Acts chapter number 7. Acts chapter number 7, if you recall, Stephen in his sermon makes reference to Moses and his parents a couple of times in his last sermon before he is stoned. In Acts chapter 7, in verse number 21, Stephen says, but when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. But notice verse 22, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and deeds. So The deliverer prepared, right? That's our first heading, if you will, for our class this morning. Chapter 2, verses 11 through 25. We're starting to see the preparation of the deliverer. We could say, all right, subpoint A under this heading is his formal education. His formal education. The deliverer is being prepared, and we see Moses is now being given, while he's being prepared, this formal education. God is ultimately the one preparing him to be the deliverer of his people down the road, and he's actually using the Egyptians to educate Moses in this particular case. He's used the baby's tears, as we mentioned a few weeks ago, they were the first weapons in the warfare against the Egyptians. Moses' tears were as he was in the basket before Pharaoh's daughter, and now he's ultimately, in a way, using the Egyptians to educate Moses. The Egyptians, as we know them, were a remarkably advanced civilization, especially for its time. And people still marvel at what all has been accomplished by Egypt over the years. And so it's interesting, it's notable to notice the fact that Moses was educated by the Egyptians. And as we said, to think that Moses was being instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. But not only was he instructed in these things, it seems that he was also successful in everything that he did. In other words, Moses was no slouch. He wasn't just some guy that happened to be blessed with a good opportunity to be in Pharaoh's household, but he was someone, as Stephen says, was mighty in words and deeds. He was someone that was formidable. He was someone that ultimately had some clout in Egypt. So we said, isn't it obvious that God is using these circumstances to prepare his future deliverer, right? The preparation of the deliverer. Yes, God would be in total control, but Moses was going to be responsible, ultimately, eventually, for leading some 2 million or so people of God's people. And God wasn't going to tell him every single thing that he should do along the way, though he did have a large hand in that and had a large part in that. But Moses was going to need to be a leader of a lot of people, and leading a lot of people is difficult. It's no easy task. And so to have a leader of this caliber that is mighty in word and deed, having been educated in one of the most powerful civilizations in history, it must be recognized that God is preparing this man. Okay? And so it's important for us to take note of that. We might even say that this is a Trojan horse in a way, that Moses is being prepared by the Egyptians to ultimately, eventually combat them and to deliver the people of God. Another element to this education that Moses is receiving is that it would likely have been beneficial for the sake of the respect of the people that he would eventually be leading. Any leader that is going to take people somewhere needs to be qualified in some regard, whether that be by education or experience. Okay, eventually Moses is going to be leading some 2 million people. And if he's just been somebody that's uneducated, has no experience at all in any form or fashion, the people of Israel are going to buck that. And we know that there was a little bit of difficulty at first to get the people to follow Moses, but because of God being with him, and certainly the fact that Moses was no uneducated or unexperienced man would have been helpful. Okay, so the preparation of the deliverer. First and foremost, subpoint A, if you will, his formal education. But secondly, consider that his feelings are stirred. God is preparing this man to be his future deliverer, so he gives him this formal education, but then secondly, stirs his feelings. Now, whether or not God caused this particular situation, I can't speak to that, but it seems that Moses just happened to come across these individuals that are fighting, right? And they're striving, and ultimately these people, the Egyptians, kill one of the Hebrews, and so we find that Moses comes across that situation, and his feelings are stirred by this. His feelings are stirred by this, and he looked upon their burdens. He looked upon their burdens. That's what is interesting to notice, that phrase in verse number 11, that Moses looked at their burdens. Keep that in the back of your mind, because we're going to notice something else later in the chapter here in just a moment. But Moses looks upon their burdens, and this was a man who was the meekest man in all of the earth. Numbers chapter 12 and verse number 3. Now, whether or not he develops that meekness later on, or he's already possessed some of those characteristics here, certainly Moses is largely who he is at this point. Although he grows, he's somebody that has already developed his personality. He's someone that has to have been meek, at least at some regard at this point. But this particular instance causes him to be enraged. And after Moses learns all that he does in the court of Pharaoh, he's presented with an opportunity to look upon the struggles of the people and feel compassion and feel empathy. Like we said, we don't know that God caused the Egyptian to beat this man to death, nearly to death, but could it providentially be that God presented Moses with the opportunity to at least see what was taking place? And that through that instance, as we've mentioned time and time again, right up to this point, we haven't seen God working or God mentioned specifically in chapters 1 and 2. But God is working behind the scenes to bring about this deliverer and to prepare him. And so he's stirring his feelings, allowing him to see the beatings and the oppression that the people of Israel are facing. And so what I'm suggesting is that it's possible that part of the preparation phase of Moses becoming the ultimate deliverer for the people of Israel is that he was put in a position to see what was really going on. And he needed to see the injustice, and he couldn't be in this luxurious palace to fix it, to see what was going on. And so perhaps God worked something providentially to cause Moses to be in that place in that day. So God's preparing this deliverer. He's given him a formal education. He's stirring his feelings. And then in verses 12 through 14, Moses comes across failure. Okay? His failure. Verses 12 through 14, read with me. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to the one who did the wrong, "Why are you striking your companion?" And then he said, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" So Moses feared and said, "Surely this thing is known." So we might title this few verses his failure. That is, his initial attempt to free the Jews, to free the people of Israel. Moses' attempt to protect his people from the abuse of the Egyptians was certainly admirable, but as a critical reader may again assume that Moses' actions would not be morally upright, as this was the case, it's interesting to think about the fact that Moses might have felt like a failure on multiple fronts. It's not that Moses was somebody that was wrong for feeling that this injustice was wrong, but he took matters into his own hands, and he was trying to do it on his own terms and in his own way. And through this particular situation, he failed to gain the respect of the Hebrews in his act to protect them. And it's interesting that they ask him, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" in this circumstance, because later on he will be that. But he also failed to personally free the Jews through his own actions, and through that he no doubt would have felt a sense of failure. He may have felt that he failed as an Egyptian even to bring or to do well with all that he'd been privileged with. And so there's failure that Moses could have been feeling on multiple fronts. That is, he's not doing anything right in this circumstance. He's homeless in a sense. He's trying to do right by his brethren, but they're mad at him. But yet also he's going against the people that he's lived with and been educated by for so many years. Okay? But think about this. Okay, how is failure a way for God to be preparing the future deliverer, Moses? Okay, he's given him a formal education. He stirred his feelings. Failure. It's an important part of the process to becoming a successful leader many times. Think about it. You've probably seen the little stories that are passed around on social media about Bill Gates or about Walt Disney or about Steve Jobs and others that were first rejected, right? They failed first, or maybe many times, and then ultimately eventually became successful. In this case, Moses failing at helping to rescue his kinsman wasn't maybe for the sake of making him more tenacious, to make him more like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, to say, "I'm just going to keep working at it until I get it right." But rather, if you think about it, at this point, Moses, as we said, was trying to become a self-appointed deliverer, to be someone that was self-appointed over the Hebrews, which was admirable to desire that they would be delivered, It was admirable to be desired that their oppression would be stopped. But in the end, it was God who needed to appoint Moses, and it had to be done God's way. And so God is preparing Moses again through education, through feelings being stirred, through his failure to accomplish his will. Failure brought him down a few notches, maybe. Think about Moses in the position that he was, right? And Pharaoh's household has pretty much anything at his disposal that he wants. And now, here's this time that he wants to accomplish something, and perhaps maybe for the first time in his life, he can't accomplish it because it's not in the cards for him. In other words, it's not God's will at that moment for it to happen that way. And so God is using this to ultimately prepare Moses as his future deliverer. Now, having said all of that, Moses is to be commended for the faith that he had in that circumstance, as the Hebrews writer does in Hebrews chapter number 11. In the sense that he says, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24, and he chose rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. All right, so Moses is to be commended. Don't misunderstand me. He's to be commended for what he's doing here to a certain degree. Okay, but ultimately, Moses wasn't taking the path that God wanted him to take, and he didn't maybe know at this point exactly what God wanted of him. But this failure that takes place in this moment is God using perhaps this opportunity to further develop and further prepare his future deliverer. All right. So we have his formal education, his feelings being stirred. We have this last section, which was his failure. But then notice verse number 15, now his flight. His flight. How is God using this particular instance or this particular circumstance to prepare Moses? Read verse 15. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So to add insult to injury, right, we could say this is a continuation of the failure phase. To add insult to injury, now Moses is on the run. And when you're on the run, there's no such thing as comfortable living. Moses' journey may have consisted of some 200 miles, depending on where his journey exactly began and where ultimately it would have ended. The Midianites perhaps being a nomadic type of people, so we don't know exactly where Moses may have ended up here. But if this is true, some 200 miles, you're looking at a maximum of 20 miles a day that any normal human being could accomplish, but more likely a max of 10 miles a day. So you're looking at anywhere between 10 and 20 days of being on the run in the desert. And that's at a minimum, assuming he has all the resources that he needs. Okay? So here's Moses, this great man in the house of Pharaoh, and now he's out in the desert for half a month. He's on the run, some 20 days or so of agony, walking through a desert without your shaded caravan that you would likely would have had before, without camels carrying your water, palm leaves fanning you. Quickly, he's going from a man of luxury to a man of poverty. In my mind, as I was thinking about this growing up, I just always imagined, here's Moses, he goes straight from Egypt to Midian, right? I understood it took a little while to get there, but then once he was in Midian, okay, well now he's in Jethro's household and, everything's all well and good. But at the end of verse 15, it says that he dwelt in the land of Midian, so it seems like maybe he was there for a certain amount of time, and then he sits down by a well, or however much time he's there, we don't know, but it's not like he just immediately, all of a sudden, after making his way from Egypt to the land of Midian, that he's protected and that he has what he needs. And so Moses has gone from luxury to lacking, from prince to poverty. This man has dropped down a few notches again, from his failure in his initial attempt to rescue the people of Israel, to his fleeing from Egypt to Midian, and now ultimately we might classify the last section of the preparation of the deliverer to this, his ultimate fall. So Moses He failed, he fled, and now he's fallen all the way down to a sheep herder. A sheep herder. He's at the bottom of his downward spiral with this new occupation. That's not to be disparaging against anyone that's a farmer or a rancher of any type, right? But when you go from being the head of one of the most powerful, or in the household of the head of the most powerful civilization in ancient history, to being a sheep herder of a nomadic people in the land of Midian, this man has fallen a long way. Just think of all that Moses had been instructed in. Perhaps he had been the lead engineer and foreman on the construction of some project like the pyramids, or over 100 men of some sort, in some regards, accomplishing some task. But here he is now, watching over maybe a few dozen sheep in the middle of a desert. Perhaps you have been there. Maybe once you were the boss, and then later you lost your job and you had to start over at the bottom again. Maybe you know what that's like. And maybe you feel for Moses a little bit in this circumstance, and how he would have been maybe downtrodden, discouraged. Was all this an accident, or was it perhaps by design? God's hand working behind the scenes of history. Again, could it not be said that God was preparing Moses even in this instance? He's prepared him in his formal education. He's prepared him in his feelings being stirred. He's prepared him in his failure. He's prepared him through his flight, having to rely and trust upon God. And now he's fallen all the way down to a sheep herder. Certainly he would have been humbled by this circumstance. But what's more, he was learning how to lead sheep, which is interesting because at the time Moses didn't know it, but eventually he was going to be leading a bunch of sheep in the future. A bunch of sheep known as the Israelites through a wilderness for some 40 years. And he spent 40 years leading the sheep in the land of Midian, and he was eventually going to be leading the sheep of the children of Israel for some 40 years. So it's interesting to take note of that as well. We say all of this as we come to the end of chapter 2 and emphasize again what we observed last week or a few weeks ago. Certainly the Hebrews would have desired other circumstances prior to chapter 2, verse number 23. But in chapter 2, verse number 23, what do we see happening? Now it happened in the process of time, after Moses has fled, he's in Midian, that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of their bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. A couple of weeks ago, we made mention of this. It's in this moment, this very moment, that the children of Israel are groaning to God and asking for deliverance, that God has already been preparing a deliverer. Before they even had asked for it, certainly maybe they had done this before. It's recorded in chapter 2, verse 23. But at least in our text, the way it reads, before there's ever a mention of them groaning for deliverance, God has already been preparing a deliverer for them in Moses. It's a remarkable thing to think about. And so, when we wonder sometimes, where is God when we're crying out to him for help? We might say, rest well, wearied heart. Because God already knows. God has likely already been working on it. If you look at Matthew chapter number 6 and verse number 8, we know that our God knows exactly what we need before we even ask of him. And beautifully, the way that this is phrased here is in contrast to the approach of some who think that they will be heard for their many words. But instead, it's not that prayers with many words are wrong, but more specifically, is your prayer in trusting faith? Knowing that God is going to take care of you. Even when you don't have many words to say, even when you don't know exactly how things are going to turn out, you know that God is in control and that things are going to work out for the best according to his will. When you're praying to God, you're wondering and you're groaning before him like the children of Israel were, do you have the faith to know? As you study the book of Exodus with us this quarter, do you have the faith to know that God already has it under control, that he's already been working on the circumstance? We're not promised to be delivered out of the circumstance the same way that the Israelites were delivered out of their circumstance. But ultimately, the biggest circumstance that we're delivered from is the problem of sin. It's the penalty of sin that we have been delivered from through the blood of Jesus. And so to think about that as the ultimate, most important thing, no matter what circumstance we're going through, God has already prepared a deliverer for us in his Son, Jesus Christ. It's also very interesting to think about the fact that when we compare the language here used about the children of Israel, about them groaning and crying, it's not speaking disparagingly of them here, as it would be later on when they are murmuring against God or murmuring against Moses. And so don't assume it is wrong, or don't think it to be wrong that when you cry out to God, when you're groaning before God, that there's anything wrong with that. In fact, it may be said that when you do that, you're demonstrating your faith because you realize that that's where you need to turn, who you need to turn to. And so it's okay to cry and to groan to God and plead with God, but it's not okay to complain and murmur against God. We'll get to that later, though. By the way, we mentioned this earlier. I love the language that is used to describe God's response to their groaning. Notice verse 25. God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. Remember what is said of Moses in chapter 2, verse number 11, that he looked at their burdens. He looked at their burdens. It's interesting to notice that similar language is used speaking of God and Moses in those circumstances. Okay. Any questions or comments as we've concluded chapter number 2 before we move into chapter number 3? Things that we missed or things that are important to talk about? All right, so we have the deliverer prepared in chapter number 2, but as we'll say, the preparation of the deliverer doesn't end at the end of chapter number 2. That's just for our outline purposes. That's kind of how we're organizing it. We could say that the preparation of the deliverer continues into chapter number 3, but we'll more effectively call this section of chapter number 3 all the way through chapter 4, the deliverer being called, okay? The calling of the deliverer. And so we mentioned in chapter number 1 and 2, if you recall a few weeks ago, we said, at the end of Genesis, you've reached kind of this climax of the story, right? God's man, Joseph, has been pushed down, he's been oppressed, he's been thrown into prison, and God's taking care of him, and we see it at the end of chapter number 50 that Joseph realizes that God was meaning all these things to him for good. And you come to the end of chapter number 50, and for the first time reader, you're kind of on this high, if you will, that, wow, this is awesome, this is a great story, and God came through for Joseph. And then you open into chapter number 2, in Exodus chapter 1 and 2, and you're wondering, where did God go? Okay? At least the first time reader that doesn't know what's going to happen next, right? What happened to this situation? I thought they were all under control. Now we notice that the writer mentions through inspiration that this new Pharaoh arose that did not know Joseph in chapter 1, I believe verse 7. Okay, but the first time reader is wondering, why did this happen? Why did God allow this to happen? In fact, it's so bad now that these people are killing babies, and you're maybe left to wondering as a first time reader, what happened to God? Where is God now? But it's important to emphasize again that God has been working behind the scenes, no doubt, to prepare this deliverer Moses to make sure that he is ready for the time that comes in chapter number 3 when God finally does appear, if you will. Though we know he's been working, he's there specifically in chapter number 3. So we have another gap in time here in Moses' life, some 40 years that Moses is tending sheep. You have to wonder what Moses was thinking and feeling during this time. Surely he continued to hurt for the burdens of his kinsmen. Surely he longed for their deliverance. We have to ask the question, why did God wait 40 years for that time before he went to Moses to call him to deliver the people of Israel? I don't know the answer to that question, but as we'll see, maybe it took 40 years for Moses to really be prepared right for this circumstance, because as we're going to notice from Moses' response to his calling, that Moses maybe wasn't quite ready yet until God spoke with him a little bit more. And so why why do we wonder about these things? It seems that perhaps Moses needed all the preparation that he could get for even this epic encounter with Pharaoh on the horizon. Moses even, it seems, needed still some tough love. And so let's consider chapter number 3 in this way. Let's first look at where Moses was. Where Moses was. In chapter number 3, Moses was, verse number 1, tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, or the mountain of God. All right, so where was Moses? He's tending the flock in the desert. He comes to Horeb, and Horeb is known, if you tuned in last week for any amount of time, it's known as the mountain of God. And as we look forward to the future, this is the same mountain that they'll eventually come back to, that Moses will lead some 2 million Hebrews to receive the law. It's also known as Mount Sinai. It's the same place, same location, just referred to with 2 different names. Now, why it has 2 different names, there's debating reasons as to why that's the case. Some may point to maybe just being different languages being used to refer to different places, much like you think about Mount Denali in Alaska, how it was later referred to as Mount McKinley, but now is referred to as Mount Denali again, just depending on who names it at what time. And so here's Moses. Where is he? He's at Horeb, the mountain of God, which is interesting to take note of, because eventually this is where, again, as we said before, he'll be bringing the people back to. But let's key in on now what Moses saw. So where was he? He was at Horeb, but what did he see? He sees the angel of the Lord appearing to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. And so he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. The bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this, turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. And so when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. And moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen this oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a large and good land, flowing with milk and honey, to a place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And so we see that Moses sees a bush, a burning bush, that was in flame, but it was not consumed. And there's another component of this vision the scene that Moses sees. He sees the bush, he sees the fire, and there is within the fire the angel of the Lord. What we might classify, or what we might notice, is what's sometimes referred to as a theophany. A theophany, a word that we just use to refer to as something that is an image or a representation of God, a manifestation of God that's tangible to the human senses. And so the question is, what is the angel of the Lord? And that's always been a question for many people. Was it God, or was it an angel as we typically think of it? Maybe how sometimes many in the world think of an angel being someone garbed in white with wings of some sort. Was it that type of angel, or was this something different? There's a good case to be made for this being God. If you remember, the word angel really just means a messenger or a minister or a servant. It doesn't mean necessarily, the root definition of the word doesn't necessarily mean the image that most people think of when you think of the word angel. It just means messenger or minister or servant. In this case, God being this theophany, if you will, this angel of the Lord, this manifestation of God in a tangible way for the human senses. There's a good case for this to be made for this being God as we know him. And we'll talk more in just a moment about this, but why do we say this is a good case to be made for this? The writer, verse number 4, says that Elohim calls him from the bush. God calls him from the bush. It doesn't say that God is speaking through an angel or a messenger in a different type of way, but rather that God calls him directly from the bush. Also, verse number 5, the one speaking claims that the ground that Moses was on was holy. If it was just an angel, as in other cases in which we have angels perhaps at the tomb of Jesus, we don't have that particular idea insinuated to us that the ground in which an angel was upon would necessarily be holy. But rather that God calls this ground holy, and God alone is holy and separate in that way. But also the speaker reveals himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He doesn't say that he's speaking on behalf of again, or that God sent him, but rather that he is the God. He reveals himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. But also notice Moses' response of a refusal to look. Moses took this to mean that the entity was in fact God. Now again, there is a strong case also to be made that, okay, this is God. What exactly does that mean? There's a strong case also to be made that this particular entity could have actually been Jesus. And we won't take the time on that this morning, but if you want more information, I'd be happy to share some good information with you on that. But it's a possible explanation that this could have been Jesus. But ultimately, it is consistent to say that this was deity speaking directly to Moses in this circumstance. So the question then, okay, is, well, why did God appear to Moses in this way? Well, why didn't he choose any other type of miraculous approach? Was there some sort of symbolism to God appearing to Moses through the burning bush? There's lots of suppositions about this and different approaches. Some surmise that this was symbolic of the Israelites, that they were God's light in the world, that they were persecuted and oppressed, but they were not consumed, much like the bush was not consumed. Or that with the coming plagues and fiery judgment that the Israelites would be in the midst of peril, but that they would not be consumed. Or that in the coming days, as God would exact judgment on their grumbling and complainings, that the glory of the Lord like a consuming fire would not consume the people of Israel, as God would demonstrate his mercy and preserve the people in the land of Canaan. We don't know for sure. Why did God choose this specific way? Others have surmised that this was symbolic of what God was planning to do with Moses, that God's powerful fire in the weak vessel of Moses' body, that with God's help, Moses would accomplish great things. Like I said, a multitude of different reasons for why God had chosen this that people have surmised over the years. We could spend a whole class on talking about perhaps the various concepts of symbolism in the burning bush. But there are some things we can say with certainty, and that's this: that this miraculous event would have been startling and a bit unnerving for Moses, something he'd never seen before, but it would also have been faith-confirming. It would have been something that would have been, in the future, for Moses, something to look back on as a tangible, real proof that the God of heaven was sending him on a mission. That this wasn't just some sort of a fluke thing or that he was tricked into believing this, but this was something that he had never seen before. He couldn't explain other than being directly from God. And as such, in the future events of God revealing himself to the people in the pillar of fire by day and in the glory of the Lord being like a consuming fire on Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter number 16, that Moses would undoubtedly remember what he saw here first on this first calling, that he was charged with delivering the people. And he'd also remember where he was at that time and how far he had come in leading the people of Israel. But more importantly, how far God had brought him. So every time he'd see a fire or see the glory of the Lord or the Lord dwelling in the tabernacle, no doubt in Moses' mind, he would inevitably have been led back to where it all began. And so it's important to think about it in that way. So what did Moses see? He saw the burning bush, but it wasn't consumed. What did Moses hear? What did God say to him? As we said, God introduces himself as the God of Moses' fathers, the same God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. In verse number 7 through 10, God introduces to Moses his plan for him. And it's also interesting to notice that Moses, that God for the first time is called holy. And if we were to read the Bible the way that it's laid out, first time called holy, or at least holy ground here in which he is standing. The holiness is associated with God. But at the same time, God reveals himself to be compassionate and aware of his people's sorrows. So God is saying, look, the ground you're standing on is holy, but also at the same time, I realize what my people are going through. Not that holiness and compassion are mutually exclusive, but it's important to notice that both can go hand in hand. It's the first time that God calls his people my people, that he calls Israel my people. It's the first occasion in which God calls himself the I Am, or Yahweh, from which we get Jehovah, the self-existent one. And it's important to say all of this because when we ask the question, what did Moses hear? God is revealing himself to Moses. He's saying, I'm the God of your fathers. I am holy. I am Yahweh. I am the one that possesses a people. I am compassionate. I possess all these characteristics. If you recall a few weeks ago, we established the fact that that God's goal through the book of Exodus, in many ways, is to reveal himself to his people and to the Egyptians. As we close, notice chapter 7, verse number 5. Exodus chapter number 7, verse number 5. What is God's goal in the plagues that are coming? Verse number 5 of chapter 7, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. It's not just that he's trying to deliver them as that's his only goal, but also that he's trying to reveal and communicate effectively, I am the Lord. But not just the Egyptians. As we close, consider chapter 10, verse number 1 and 2. Who else is God trying to reveal himself to and communicate his power to? Now the Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine before him, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son, notice, that you may tell in the hearing of your son and your son's son the mighty things that I have done in Egypt and my signs which I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. God is trying to communicate this to Moses and ultimately trying to communicate this to the Egyptians, to the children of Israel. I am the Lord. Now, we're running out of time. Drew's going to pick up next week in chapter number 5. I want you to take some time this week, because we're going to have to skip over it. We're going to try to get all this done in this quarter. I want you to take some time, spending some time reading through the end of chapter 3, all the way through chapter 4, and seeing the responses that Moses gives to God whenever God gives him a task or when God tells him what he's going to do with him. Okay? Moses asks God several questions and has a couple of rebuttals. Take note of those things and start asking yourself in your own life if those are some of the same questions that maybe you ask in the responsibilities that God has given to you. Okay, and it's going to be a good study, something that I've been mulling over, thinking about preaching from in the future. It's something that's especially appropriate perhaps when it comes to evangelism. Think about the task that God gave to Moses and the excuses that Moses gives back to God. Okay, so spend some time this week, because we're not going to have time to be able to study that at length next week. Drew's going to jump into chapter number 5 next week, but definitely spend some time looking at those. I believe would be beneficial for you. Thanks for your attention this morning.